Hi everyone and welcome to this full-length 40-minute tutorial all about creating a blurred or bokeh background in soft pastel. I'm using my recent little Harris Hawk study to demo this, and I'll show you from beginning to end how I edit my photograph and take you right through the pastel process. I used a selection of Unison soft pastels which I'll share as I go along. Over on my Patreon channel, you'll find my full growing catalogue of these tutorials and lots more. But I do try to add some free content here on my YouTube channel for everyone else, so I hope you enjoy this. So this was my full reference shot of the bird, which I've brought into Photoshop just to crop for my head study. I'd love to come back and paint the whole bird, but just as an experiment and first time doing feathers on pastel matte paper, I thought I would do a smaller head study of about 10 inches big. So I chose a nice crop, and although I like the background, I like the colours, it's quite busy. I wouldn't want quite as much detail as that in my background. So using the polygon lasso tool, and I add a little bit of feathering to it. I'm not very neat about this. I've shown this technique a few times in some of my tutorials, and I really just want to get an image that helps me imagine better the effect that I'm trying to achieve. So I don't need this to be neat. Just roughly cut around the bird and select all the background. And then there's a really neat trick which I love on Photoshop, and it's in filters. It's the Gaussian Blur. And you can adjust this however much you want. I often sit and play with this and see just how much out of focus I want the background to be. In this case, quite a lot, because I intended to put a lot of detail in the face and the feathers of the hawk. So this was the image that I had to work from. And we'll make a start. I'm using brown pastel matte. And I begin firstly with my lovely sky blue, just to block in the main shape that the trees will make behind the bird. And I really like the texture of pastel matte. It's not as rough as some of the sanded papers. It does have a bit of a grain to it, you can see the texture, but it's also quite smooth, and when you get a few layers of pastel onto it, it moves around really nicely. But first things first, just to block in roughly some shapes. Just picking out any little areas that I can see some of that blue. And as a general rule with soft pastel, I tend to work from dark to light. So the first colours that I look for are some of those darker tones shining through the trees. And I pick a bit more of a vibrant dark green. I tend to use the photo reference as a bit of a guide. If I like the shapes that are in the photo reference, I'll include them. If I don't like what's going on, you have plenty of artistic license to edit as you go. So I'm not always 100% sure where I'm going with the background. A lot of experimenting, a lot of scary moments where it looks terrible, but you work through those, and the wonderful thing about pastel is being able to create many layers. I apply my pastel quite thinly, and I build the effect up quite slowly. So if you apply thin layers, you always give yourself a chance to make changes and really judge it as you go along. I find if you're really heavy-handed to begin with, you can fill up the entire tooth of the paper, and you'll find it difficult to add more layers on top. So at the minute I'm just using a selection of the darker greens, trying to block in a little bit. I don't cover the whole paper in one colour though. I try to block in certain areas. I want there to be many colours shining through, which will add real richness and depth. So I work quite slowly. Just at this point still using the sides of the big Unison pastel sticks. They're so useful on their sides, broken down into smaller pieces, but for blocking in, I love using the big sticks on their sides. And I'm really just going around blocking in where the bush is. Again, not adding many thick layers of pastel at this stage. Having a good look at the photo reference. A lot of the time I'm looking at the colours around the edges of the hawk. I want to be sure that where there's a dark edge on the hawk, I can contrast that with a bit of light colour in the background and vice versa. So I'm really looking at the ultimate number of ways I can make this hawk pop out from the background. And I hope my blending doesn't make you too dizzy, but there's a lot of blending in this piece. So quite often I'll just speed that little bit up. I'm giving all of that pigment a good rub into the paper. It doesn't start to move nicely yet. I've only got 1 or 2 layers on the paper, so it's still really tough to get it to all blend together. But no matter, I give it a quick rub into the paper, ready for my next layers of colour. So all the time just building up the layers gradually, trying to introduce lots of the colours that I'm intending to use within the hawk. So all of the warm brown earths and red earths that I'll use, I'll make sure to leave those in my pastel tray for when I'm working on the hawk. That's really important if you're creating a background to try and use some of those same colours within the main subject. It really helps to harmonise the colours within your painting. So another useful way to use the pastel on its side, quite often after I've done the initial blocking in, it will be a little half stick or a broken stick that I start to use on its side. A bit like moving down the brush sizes, picking up smaller brushes as you need a bit more detail. So this would be like a slightly smaller brush just to start to block in some of the lighter shapes. So although using the blur tool in Photoshop helps me get my photo reference looking a little more like how I want my painting to look, a lot of the time I really am just trying to blur my vision a little bit and avoiding any kind of detail, so bigger marks only on the background. So you won't see me use any pastel pencil on this background. I'll use lots of pastel pencil on the details on the feathers and the bird, but for most of my backgrounds it's the soft pastels. So starting to bring in more of the golden brown earths and yellows that we see in the trees, but still trying to make sure that I've got enough depth in some of the darker areas, as I really want those to shine through. And it's at this stage on the paper that I can really feel the layers of pastel start to work a little. It starts to become a little easier to move the pigment around. And I'm already starting to think about that little area just behind the beak there. The bottom of the beak is quite dark. And it's such a focal point of the bird, so I know I'll come back to this area again and decide how to treat that little area just behind the beak. So while I'm painting the background, I'm constantly looking at the main subject, seeing if there are any edges that I can enhance the colour contrast a little more. And you can see that if I decide I haven't gone dark enough, it's not a problem to come back in with some dark pigment over the top of it. Even though it looks scary when you put it on, just remember that it's the lower layers. Your lower layers can look messy, and most of the way through painting this background I was really unsure of it, but I know that if you persevere, then you get enough layers of pastel on there and really take your time and think about the colours, then I hoped that it would come good in the end. But it was a bit of a worry while I was working on it. You can see that all the way through it doesn't look very attractive. And quite often the backgrounds just don't look very attractive until you get a bit of the main subject in. So a lot to do with using your imagination as you go along. And this is a little trick just to knock everything back into the distance a little more, so to make everything a little bit lighter all over. And I do this a lot on velour paper, and I wondered would it be possible on pastel matte paper also. So I'm just using the side of a lighter coloured brown earth, and I'm really, as lightly as I can touch the paper, adding a little layer all over. It's really as light as I can make it in most places. And I'm hoping that those colours that I've already applied underneath, when I blend, they'll start to shine through and everything will start to mix really nicely. So if you feel that you've gone a bit dark, a bit heavy-handed in the background of a portrait, quite often I pick up a lighter coloured pastel and add a very thin layer right over everything. It's good to do it in these mid layers though, so I'm nowhere near filling the paper by this stage. And it's good just to knock everything back a little. Start to get everything to mix nicely on the paper. And the same with the blue sky. I've added some of those darker areas down the sky, which obviously stand out too much at this stage. But another little thin layer of blue just starts to melt them in a little bit. And I'm really not leaning heavily, very lightly, sort of scumbling the pigment onto the paper. You don't have to lean very heavily with soft pastel. Such a great amount of pigment and colour comes off these sticks. So I'm just trying to firm up a little bit of the outline of the tree. Obviously I want all the edges to remain nice and soft. But I'm just trying to create some more of those interesting blurry shapes that we can see. And at this stage, I'm really starting to dislike how solid the green tree area is. It seems just really solid behind the bird. And I really love this blue colour, so I start to think about ways that I can maybe break up the trees a little bit. And I can actually see some blue gaps in between the bushes. And then a nice bit of blending. At this stage it gets really satisfying to blend it together because it all starts to move. You can blend lightly or where you want to really soften an effect, you can really scrub at the paper. But at this area, I'm really just lightly blending everything together. And I'm able to use my fingertips on this paper, unlike some of the rougher, sandy papers. I'm finding that some blending tools or perhaps gloves might be better for some of the rougher papers, but Pastel mat is great, a little like velour, it's not sore on your fingertips. And I love being able to get my hands messy, so this suits me. So trying to bring in a little bit more warmth down this side of the bushes. But after knocking everything back, I also feel that I need to go and just reinforce some of those darker areas. Again, by the end of the painting, they'll probably get knocked back a little bit between all the blending. But I definitely want a sense of depth in this. And that's why I'm rarely trying to create a colour or an effect using just one colour. I'm usually trying to layer my colours up and create more richness. So I go and add some more of those darker greens again. Now that I have a better feel for where I want them to be. And you can see at this stage just how nicely it all softens into the colours underneath. So all the time just looking for little prominent shapes in the foliage that I would like to include. But at the end of the day, it really won't matter too much if it looks exactly like my photo reference. It's really just there to give me my palette and some ideas for the composition. So it always looks really strong when I apply the soft pastel here. But it's so easy just to blend it in and keep enhancing that blurry out of focus effect. And I love using bokeh photography. I get out and about with my camera a lot. These birds in particular were close to where I live in the south of Spain, up in the mountains. And I went for a falconry experience day, took my camera. But it's difficult to photograph birds. You don't always get the background how you would like. So I have a ton of photo reference, but most of them I'll be playing about with the backgrounds, changing them. And I do make use of Photoshop a lot for that. I'll sit with a collection of photographs that I've taken and I'll cut and paste birds from one scene into another and really play about with my photo reference to find some nice compositions. So I'd be lost without Photoshop. I really do use it daily as a tool for my art. And I enjoy working from photo reference. It's wonderful to work from life, but I love the editing possibilities and the artistic license that you can take with photographs, especially if you're working from your own photo reference. I take a lot of wildlife photographs and all sorts of photo reference, which I also share with my patrons over on my Patreon channel. So each month I'll do a different theme of tutorial. That tutorial series might be anything up to 4 hours long, giving you full narration and lots of tips and lots of real-time footage. And along with that month then, you'll also get access to some royalty-free reference images that you can practice on, create your own paintings. So next month on Patreon, I'll be focusing on the hawk itself. I thought I'd bring out an early background tutorial, as I know that that's something that a lot of artists struggle with. It was certainly something that I have struggled with and still do sometimes. The backgrounds are usually quite a difficult aspect of my work. But when you want something that's really effective and simple like this one, you can't beat a bit of blurry foliage to set off your wildlife subject. So next month on Patreon, if you're interested in seeing how I created the hawk, I'll be going into super detail in my tutorial series on painting feathers. So for these sections towards the right, I'm very tentatively working at this part. Very thin layers of pastel are going on. Usually when I'm most unsure of an area, I work in really thin layers. That way I can undo any colour that I've applied that I suddenly think, oh no, that's not right. So I don't commit to anything, especially in the backgrounds. Everything's open to change. And I take a lot of walks away from the piece, look at it from a distance. I'm always saying that I have a mirror hanging behind me where I work, and it really helps to just turn around sometimes and glance at your painting in the mirror. It really can make something that's not that obvious while you're working on it, but it can make it seem glaringly obvious all of a sudden in its reflection. So I've come back to this little area below the beak, and I'm lightening that whole area as I really want that beak to stand out. And again, even at this late stage, coming back in with a little bit of my darker green. Just trying to make the edges of every dark area look a little less uniform, I think. Most of nature is pretty random. There are a lot of patterns, but it's the randomness of things like blades of grass or leaves on a tree that will make it look really realistic. So I'm still bothered by the great lump of greenery that is the bushes, and I decide to try and break it up a little bit more with some blue sky. So even at this late stage, I can decide to add some little bursts of blue just breaking through the bushes. And I'm hoping that that's going to add a bit more interest to that area. Just make it less of a block of greenery. And I just love this blue colour. I use it in a lot of my skies, along with some both lighter and darker versions made by Unison. But this one in particular is dreamy, and you can see that it really does suit the sunny Spanish blue skies that we get down here. There's a very different light down in the south of Spain. I'm really enjoying finally getting around to painting some photo reference from here. I've been here for a while now, but too busy with commissions and other things on my list to get a chance to paint anything with Spanish lighting. So hopefully this year I'm going to get to delve into more of my own photo reference and finally get to paint some of the vibrant colours that I see everywhere down here. So another round of blending, and you can see that sky area just start to smooth in a little more now. And that makes it a little bit easier for me to come back in with some little bits of pigment and just create some more of the shapes that I can see down in the bottom corner. The more layers of pastel I have on the paper, each time it gets a little bit easier to move the pigment around and apply the next layer easily and then blend it into the layers below. And you don't always want to go for a really blended finish, but in my blurred backgrounds it really is the best technique for this. Lots and lots of blending. Make sure there's no hard edges. I try to make sure that each colour melts into the colour next to it. And it depends how blurry you go, of course, with your background. But in this case, I really wanted it to be extremely soft and distant. And I think that some of those blue areas already start to help just break up that band of green a little. So I start to breathe a little easier at this stage. It starts to take shape a little bit. And I bring in some of that warm red earth again. A colour that's going to feature a lot in the hawk, so it's good that it warms up the background. And that big light brown earth one that I used earlier to knock everything back, again I'm using it on its side just to start and create some lighter areas down this left hand side. I sort of want my background to be a little bit lighter than the photo reference. A little bit more distant. Really want the hawk to pop at the end. So it's important that this background doesn't become distracting. And another layer of blending just to soften all of that into the paper. And I'm still finding little areas that I can use to break up the green with some blue sky shining through. It definitely started to help once I created some of these little gaps in the foliage. I probably spend as much time rubbing this piece as I did applying pigment onto it. But that really is the key for me with the bokeh backgrounds. No hard edges. Try and go for a softer focus. And make sure that you use colours that are lighter than your subject matter also. Just to give it that sense of distance. So I'm often dragging my marks onto the paper in a diagonal manner, but a lot of the time when I'm blending with my fingers, I'm using little circular motions. Just trying to get rid of any of the marks, any of the lines. I really don't want any of that showing. I want it to be as smooth and out of focus as possible. So you can see in the photo reference that little area of warmth up there. I am still following the photo reference. Just for ideas, if I think it looks nice, I'll include it. I don't do that well from imagination alone. I really like working from photo reference. It can give me some basis to go from. And I can enhance what I see. I can work from my imagination, especially if I was there at a place. Like with this photo reference, I have such a memory of being there and seeing this light. And that definitely helps. But as an artist, you can definitely use some artistic license to enhance what you see in any photo reference. I know for me though, I like it to be as close to my vision of the finished painting as possible before starting, which is why I use Photoshop, just to try and help me imagine it a little more clearly. So at this stage, I really want to lighten some more of the background, really enhance some of the yellow that's coming from it's a yellow-green that's coming from the leaves, but I'm really trying to enhance the yellow. I'm bearing in mind that there's that lovely, vibrant yellow beak on the hawk. And I'm thinking at this stage it might be nice if some of that foliage is a little more yellow in the painting than it is in the photo reference. So this is a yellow that I'll keep in the pastel tray as I work, and it'll definitely get used on the hawk's beak later on, thus tying in the background to the main subject. And I immediately like how the yellow looks when I've blended it in. I can definitely picture the hawk sitting in front of that a little easier now. So I'm really into the fun stage of the background. Final adjustments, really getting to tweak smaller areas and think about those contrasts between the background and the hawk. Getting lots of distance from the piece, walking away from it, getting a good look from across the room. Sometimes it's good to stop altogether, come back to it the next day when you're halfway through. I often do that with my backgrounds. Just gives you a fresh perspective. A fresh day often lets you see what needs to happen. But it's really nice when you get to this stage on a good quality pastel paper and you can really start to make fine adjustments. I'm blending quite heavily here. You can see my easel shake a little bit. I'm leaning quite heavily there, just trying to soften that blue in, leaning especially heavy around the edges of the blue area. So not so heavy in the middle of the blue area where I want it to shine blue, but on those edges I'm definitely blending heavily there, just trying to soften them, leave no harsh lines. But this is pretty much my approach in all of my bokeh backgrounds. Just really taking my time, working in thin layers, really feeling my way into the background and judging things as I go. So they can be a bit scary to work on because they tend to look very ugly during the progress stages, and you don't have any of your lovely subject in to make you feel a bit better about how the painting's going. So backgrounds are always tough. You're faced with the blank paper to begin with, and you don't usually leave it looking very good by the time you've finished the background. One extra tip I'll give you as well, I always work the background first in a painting, and you can see that I'm not fussy about leaving clean edges on my hawk. In fact, I've purposefully gone over the edges a bit, and that means that when I come in with the fresh pastels on the edges of the hawk, it'll leave a lovely clean line between it and the background. So if anything, I want my background to overlap the subject matter a little bit so that I can create really lovely clean edges on the subject matter later on. So I'm really into the final tweaking stages now, just the last few minutes. And I hope that you've enjoyed this tutorial. I have lots of other tutorials on creating backgrounds on my YouTube channel. There's so many different types of background that I have to create in wildlife paintings and my pet portraits too, so I try and cover as much on backgrounds as possible, as I know it was my Achilles heel for a long time. So I really try and help you guys in that area in particular. So do check out my other videos all about backgrounds on YouTube. And if you're able to, have a look on my Patreon channel. For as little as $4 a month there, you can get access to my full catalogue of tutorials like this and longer, with lots of tips and lots of photo reference and projects for you to practice with. But I hope that you've enjoyed this. I'll be bringing out lots more free content here on YouTube this year. And that's thanks to the guys who are supporting me over on Patreon. So big thanks to all the people supporting me on Patreon. But to you guys as well for watching and subscribing here on YouTube. I just hit 10,000 subscribers this week, so that's thanks to you guys. Thanks very much for sharing my work around. And I've got lots of lovely bird reference from my day at this falconry centre. I've got lots of bigger projects planned of the birds in flight with a little more of a painterly approach and a bit more movement. But I'm going to be enjoying some of these smaller detailed head studies this year also. And I hope that you'll call back soon for my fresh content. And in the meantime, I hope that you'll feel inspired to get the soft pastels and pencils out and get experimenting yourself. If there are other tutorials that you'd like to see me cover, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Do drop me a line and let me know what other things you struggle with in soft pastel, or in general being an artist. I try to create videos not just about soft pastel, but also giving advice on things like pricing, posting your work, and there are lots of other instructional videos on my YouTube channel. But I hope you've really enjoyed seeing this background come together, and that it's given you some confidence and maybe some inspiration to have a go at your own. So until next time, thanks for watching and happy pasteling.